the night everything broke. If you'd told me that a neighbor's obsession with control would one day drag my teenage daughter out of the shower and turn our peaceful neighborhood into a war zone, I would have laughed and called you paranoid. But that's exactly what happened. It didn't start with sirens or flashing lights. It began with something much quieter, a slow erosion of trust, a creeping sense that someone was watching too closely, judging too harshly, and ready to act far beyond what decency allowed. And when it finally exploded, it was my family that took the hit first. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for 17 years I've worn a badge for the city of Greenwood. Not one of those big city detective jobs you see on TV, but real, exhausting neighborhood work. Burglaries, property disputes, domestic calls that turn into shouting matches and tears. The kind of work that wears your patience thin and tests your faith in people. I've seen a lot in those years, but I never thought I'd see that darkness walk right into my own home. Our homeowners association, the Ridgeview Estates Board, was supposed to be a group that protected the neighborhood's charm. Fresh lawns, tidy driveways, neighborly smiles, that's what it was built for. But under its current president, Evelyn Crane, it had become something else entirely. Evelyn had a gift for hiding cruelty behind politeness, for turning policy into a weapon, and for wrapping manipulation in a silk ribbon of civic duty. She was the kind of person who quoted bylaws like scripture and believed herself anointed to enforce them. It started with the fountain in our front yard, a small stone structure my late wife, Hannah, loved. She had found it at a roadside market before she passed, and we'd restored it together. To anyone else, it was just a garden piece, but to me and my daughter Lila, it was a heartbeat from the past, something beautiful to remember her by. When the first letter from the HOA arrived saying the fountain violated aesthetic consistency, I laughed it off. But then came the second letter, then the third, each one signed by Evelyn's looping signature and each one a little more personal. Words like non-compliance, repeated disregard, and final warning filled those pages. It wasn't just about the fountain anymore. It was about control, about dominance. I ignored her at first, hoping the nonsense would fade. But Evelyn didn't like being ignored. She escalated, small things at first. Notices taped to our door. Photographs of our backyard taken from the sidewalk. Then fines for things that weren't even violations. Improperly stored hose. No visible house number. Possible misuse of irrigation water. It was harassment, plain and simple. And still I didn't react. When you're a cop, you learn to choose your battles. I had more important things to fight for, like helping Lila adjust to life without her mother, making sure she didn't lose her smile completely to grief. Our home was supposed to be our sanctuary, until the night Evelyn crossed the line. It was late August, one of those nights where the air feels heavy, the kind of heat that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel thick. The city had recently announced water restrictions because of the drought, and Evelyn had practically crowned herself queen of compliance. She roamed the neighborhood like a self-appointed enforcer, clipboard in hand, flashlight swinging from her wrist. I was on my way home from the station, half expecting another petty letter in the mailbox when my phone buzzed with a missed call from Lila. I didn't think much of it at first. She often called about small things, dinner plans, questions about homework, reminders about groceries. But then I saw the message she'd left. Just 3 words, frantic, breathless. Dad, she's here. My stomach dropped. I drove faster than I should have. Lights off, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. When I turned the corner onto our street, I saw Evelyn's silver sedan parked halfway up my driveway, engine idling, driver's door open. The front door of my house was ajar. A wave of cold dread hit me harder than any bullet ever could. I was through that door before I even realized I'd drawn my service weapon. The sound that met me was something I'll never forget. The echo of running water. The slam of a door, and a sharp, terrified cry that didn't belong in any home. I raced up the stairs 2 at a time, calling for Lila, but her voice was strangled with panic. The bathroom door was open, steam pouring out. And there stood Evelyn Crane, the woman who'd made our lives miserable for months. Her hand gripping my daughter's arm, dragging her out of the shower like she was a criminal. Lila was wrapped in a towel, soaked, crying, struggling to cover herself. And Evelyn, she had that look in her eyes, that wild righteousness that comes when someone truly believes they're the hero of their own twisted story. She was shouting about water use, about waste, about setting an example. Her voice was sharp, full of triumph, as if humiliating a child justified her authority. "Evelyn," I said, my voice low and dangerous, the kind of tone that ends fights before they start. "Let her go. Now." She froze, startled by the badge on my belt, then tried to twist it into defiance. She was running water for 10 minutes. "Do you know how irresponsible that is during a drought? We have bylaws, Daniel, and your family isn't above them." I stepped forward, forcing her to release her grip. Lila stumbled behind me, trembling. I wanted to shout, to rage, but years on the force taught me that anger was the weapon of fools. I holstered my gun not because she deserved restraint, but because I wanted her to see the calm she could never master. "You just committed unlawful entry, assault, and harassment against a minor," I said. "You used a key that doesn't belong to you to get into my house, and you did it in the middle of the night." For a moment I saw doubt flicker in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with arrogance. "The HOA has emergency access privileges," she snapped. "If I believe there's a violation threatening community safety or resources, I'm authorized to act." "You're not law enforcement," I said, voice steady. "And there's no emergency that justifies invading someone's privacy, especially a child's." She glared at me, lips tightening. "You think your badge scares me, Daniel? This neighborhood runs by rules, not intimidation. You'd do well to remember that." That was when I noticed the small black fob dangling from her keyring, identical to the ones given to maintenance contractors. Unauthorized duplication. She must have had a locksmith replicate every resident's key access for her board members. My jaw tightened. "You made copies," I said quietly. "Did you really think no one would find out?" Her face went pale just for a heartbeat before she turned and marched past me, muttering something about reporting me for threats. I didn't stop her. I didn't need to. I already had everything I needed. My daughter's tear-streaked face, the steam still curling in the hall, and a camera above the staircase that had captured every second of her illegal entry. When the front door slammed behind her, Lila broke down, sobbing into my chest, her voice shaking. "Dad, she just walked in." I locked the door, but she had a key. I didn't even hear her at first. She said I was wasting water and she wouldn't stop yelling. Her words tumbled out in pieces, and I felt something cold and sharp click into place inside me. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was personal. She'd violated our home, our safety, our last connection to peace. And for what? To prove she could. I didn't call the station that night. I didn't file a report, not yet. I sat with Lila until she finally fell asleep, then went to my office and opened the folder I'd been quietly building for months. Every letter, every fine, every unreasonable notice, scanned and time-stamped. I added the footage from the stair camera, the call log, and her recorded voice yelling through the steam. I'd seen predators before, the ones who hide behind authority, who manipulate systems to feed their control. Evelyn was no different. She just wore pearls instead of cuffs. The next morning, our street was plastered with flyers. "Water abusers hurt everyone," they read, in bold red letters. And under that, a list of addresses. Ours was at the top. It was her way of fighting back, of turning the narrative before anyone else could speak. Neighbors glanced from their driveways, uncomfortable, uncertain. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others gave us sympathetic looks. But I didn't care about gossip. I cared about justice. That afternoon, while Lila stayed with a friend, I walked the neighborhood. People whispered as I passed, and when I reached the end of the cul-de-sac, I saw Evelyn in her element, standing at the community notice board, clipboard in hand, giving one of her accountability speeches. She talked about fairness, about sacrifice, about how some residents thought they were above the law. Her voice carried like she was preaching from a pulpit. I stood there quietly until she finished. When she turned to leave, I spoke. "Funny thing about fairness," I said evenly. "It usually doesn't involve breaking into a teenager's bathroom." The crowd went silent. Evelyn froze, her face paling slightly before she forced a smile. "Now, Daniel, let's not dramatize things. I had reasonable cause to believe when you had no cause," I interrupted. "You had a key that wasn't legally authorized. You had no right to enter my home. And if you want to keep talking about community integrity, I'd be happy to bring the footage to the next meeting. Or the courthouse." A murmur spread through the crowd. You could feel it, the spell breaking. For years she'd ruled through fear, through fines, through the quiet compliance of people too tired to fight. But now they were seeing her cracks. The guilt. the fear behind her confidence. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she didn't have control. And for the first time, the neighborhood saw it too. I walked away that day without looking back, but I knew it wasn't over. People like Evelyn don't stop when cornered. They double down. And I could already feel the storm brewing. But I also knew something else. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every person she'd intimidated, for every homeowner who'd stayed quiet out of fear, for every family she'd humiliated. Most of all, I was fighting for Lila, to prove to her that when someone crosses a line, you don't cower. You stand taller. That night, as I sat by the fountain Hannah had loved, the water gently trickling through the stone, I made myself a promise. I would bring Evelyn's entire empire down, not with anger, but with evidence, not with vengeance, but with justice, because she hadn't just invaded our home. She'd declared war on our peace, and she had no idea what kind of man she'd picked to fight with. The gathering storm. The morning after Evelyn's public humiliation at the notice board, the neighborhood felt different. The air carried a tension you could taste, a nervous anticipation that something had shifted beneath the surface. For years, Ridgeview Estates had lived under Evelyn Crane's shadow, a place where people mowed their lawns twice a week out of fear, where holiday decorations were debated like criminal offenses, where the smallest deviation from her vision brought fines and whispers. But that morning, for the first time, people were looking over their shoulders, not in fear of her clipboard, but in curiosity, wondering what would happen next. I could feel it as I stepped outside, coffee in hand, the sun barely cresting over the manicured hedges. The paper on my porch was folded neatly, but taped to it was another envelope bearing that familiar gold HOA seal. I tore it open, already knowing what to expect. Inside was a list of supposed violations that bordered on parody: fountain operating during restricted hours, failure to maintain consistent front yard aesthetic, and, my personal favorite, unauthorized hostility toward board members. I laughed, a low, humorless sound that surprised even me. She was trying to rattle me, to push me into reacting emotionally so she could paint me as the aggressor. But she didn't understand that patience was the weapon of experience. I'd spent years learning that truth always wins when you know how to sharpen it. After Lila left for school, I went to work, but my mind wasn't on paperwork or patrols. It was on the people I'd seen at that notice board the day before. The way their eyes had widened when I mentioned the footage, the way whispers spread like wind through dry grass. Fear can hold a community hostage, but once that fear cracks, change becomes unstoppable. I started making calls during lunch break, quiet ones to neighbors I trusted. The Patel family, who had once been fined for growing tomatoes in planters. Jim and Rosa Hughes, whose mailbox had been deemed non-standard size. Terrell White, the HOA treasurer, who had looked increasingly uneasy during every meeting I'd ever attended. None of them were firebrands or troublemakers. They were decent people, tired of being pushed around. Every call was met with hesitation at first, but then came the same phrase, whispered with a kind of desperate hope. If you're really doing something, Daniel, we're with you. That was all I needed to hear. By the end of the week, I'd arranged a quiet meeting at the back of Darla's Diner, the small cafe near the highway, where most board members never bothered to go. It smelled of coffee and cinnamon and worn-out leather booths. Neutral territory, perfect for what I had in mind. We met late on Friday evening, when the rush had died down and the only sound was the steady hum of the ceiling fan. There were 7 of us in total, including myself. They came in pairs and singles, careful not to attract attention, each carrying the weight of months, in some cases, years, of quiet resentment. When everyone had settled, I laid out a folder on the table, thick and worn at the edges. What I'm about to show you, I began, stays between us for now. It's not gossip. It's evidence. And if we handle it right, we'll not only stop Evelyn's harassment, we'll take back this community. The faces around me were cautious but curious. I could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the longing for someone to lead. I opened the folder and spread out the contents, photographs, violation notices, emails, scanned meeting transcripts. Then I played the clip from my home camera on my laptop. Evelyn barging into my house, dragging my daughter from the bathroom. Gasps rippled around the booth. Rosa pressed a hand to her mouth. "My God," she whispered, "she actually went inside your home?" "She did," I said, voice steady. And she had a copied master key to do it. That's not just an overstep, that's a crime. What she did to Lila isn't just a violation of privacy. It's a violation of the law. Jim, the retired electrician, leaned forward. She's been doing this for years, Daniel. Maybe not breaking into houses, but pushing people right up to the edge. We lost good neighbors over her nonsense. Then Guyans moved out because she said their door color was too reflective. Who does that? I nodded. That's why we're going to stop her. But not with shouting or protests. With facts. With proof. And we're going to do it by her own rules. The key was Terrell, the treasurer. He'd been quiet so far, staring into his untouched cup of coffee, shoulders tense. I knew from experience that guilt often looks like silence. When the others finished speaking, I turned to him. Terrell, you're on the board. You've seen the inside. You know how she runs things. Tell me something. Does she even have the authority to issue those fines or enter homes? He swallowed hard, fingers fidgeting around his wedding band. Officially, no, he said finally. Our charter gives the board authority over shared spaces and maintenance regulations, but not private property. Evelyn? She added her own clauses to the enforcement policy 2 years ago, told us she had legal counsel backing it up, but the documents were never notarized, never reviewed by the county office. She said it was a clerical delay. I believed her. I shouldn't have. A heavy silence settled over the table. Rosa was the first to speak. You mean we've been paying fines under fake authority? Terrell nodded miserably. And it's worse than that. The funds from those fines, they're supposed to go into the community maintenance account. But I've seen withdrawals that don't match any invoices. Landscaping companies that don't exist. Expenses labeled as administrative allowances. Thousands of dollars gone, and no one but Evelyn can access those records directly. It was exactly what I had suspected. Greed wrapped in governance. Evelyn's obsession with control wasn't just about power. It was about profit, and now I had a witness. I placed a reassuring hand on Terrell's shoulder. You did the right thing by coming tonight. But if we're going to take this further, I need copies of everything. Financial ledgers, emails, bank transfers, anything that ties her to misuse of funds or unauthorized access. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'll get them. But you have to promise me one thing, Daniel. If she finds out I talked, she'll destroy me. She knows where I work, she knows my family. She's already destroyed enough families, I said quietly. It's time she faced the consequences. That night, I drove home under a sky heavy with clouds, the kind that promise rain but hold it back just long enough to make you restless. Lila was asleep by the time I got in, but I stood for a while outside her room watching the soft rise and fall of her breathing. I thought about Hannah, how she used to say that courage wasn't about fighting battles you choose, but the ones that find you. Maybe this was mine. I went downstairs, turned on my laptop, and started building the case file. Not as a detective this time, but as a father. Every email Terrell sent me, every scanned receipt, every voice memo from neighbors, it all went into one folder labeled Ridgeview Operation Clean Sweep. Over the next week, Evelyn's harassment intensified. 3 more violation notices, 2 public shaming posts on the community message board accusing me of setting a poor example as a law enforcement officer, and a personal visit from her vice president, a nervous man named Carl who clearly regretted his involvement. He came to my door one afternoon, shifting awkwardly on the porch. Daniel, look, he began. Evelyn's... She's under pressure. Maybe you could just pay the fines, apologize, and we can move on. I stared at him, incredulous. Apologize for what? For having a daughter she terrorized? For using water to take a shower? He winced, lowering his voice. You don't understand. She's not going to stop. She's already told the board she'll start foreclosure proceedings if you keep refusing to comply. And there it was, and the threat I'd been expecting. Evelyn was escalating from petty to dangerous, and she was willing to weaponize the law itself. But what she didn't realize was that I'd already been steps ahead. I'd spent nights researching HOA statutes, cross-checking signatures, reviewing renewal filings with the county registrar. What I found was damning. Evelyn's re-election as president had been filed under an outdated bylaw revision that expired 3 years earlier. Legally speaking, she wasn't even the HOA president anymore. Everything she'd done since then, every fine, every notice, every policy enforcement, was built on a foundation of fraud. The next Friday, Terrell called me in a panic. Daniel, he whispered, I got the documents, but you need to see them in person. Evelyn's been laundering the fines through an old community account. She's routing money through a fake maintenance firm registered in her cousin's name. And the locksmith invoices for the master keys? They're in that same company's ledger. She made copies for all board members. That was it, the final piece. Evelyn Crane wasn't just a bully. She was a criminal masquerading as a civic leader. And now, I had the evidence to prove it. I told Terrell to meet me that evening behind the tennis courts, away from the clubhouse where Evelyn liked to hold her meetings. When he arrived, he looked like a man carrying his own coffin, pale, sweating, clutching a briefcase like a lifeline. He handed it to me, voice trembling. Everything's in there. Emails, invoices, bank statements. Just promise me you'll end this. I took the briefcase and nodded. You have my word. As I drove home, the first drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the windshield like the sky itself was finally releasing its breath. I thought about what I was about to do. Turning over evidence on someone like Evelyn wouldn't just end her rule. It would shatter the illusion of control she'd built. But it also meant stepping into the storm fully with no way back. When I got home, I laid the documents across the dining table, pages spread out like puzzle pieces of a broken empire. Lila came down, rubbing her eyes, and asked softly, "Dad, are we going to be okay?" I looked at her, the last piece of Hannah I had left, the reason I'd fight 1,000 battles if I had to. And I smiled. "We're not just going to be okay, sweetheart. We're going to be free." That night, as thunder rolled in the distance, I made the call that would set everything in motion. My captain answered on the second ring, his voice weary but familiar. "Ruiz," he said. "Captain," I replied, glancing at the mountain of evidence before me. "I think it's time we talked about Ridgeview Estates." And just like that, the storm began, the trial of shadows. The weeks that followed were like walking through a storm that refused to end. Every day, new whispers filled the air. Some said we were heroes. Others claimed we had humiliated a respectable woman. The truth was buried under rumors, fear, and pride. But my father never once wavered. I could see the quiet fire in his eyes every morning as he tied his badge to his chest, as if reminding himself that the badge was not a decoration but a promise. To protect, to serve, and to stand firm when others would crumble. For the first time, I truly understood what it meant to carry that weight. Karen, on the other hand, refused to let the dust settle. The very next week after the incident, she filed an official complaint against my father claiming police harassment, emotional distress, and violation of her rights. Her lawyer, a tall, smooth-talking man who seemed to enjoy the cameras more than the courtroom, made sure the local media knew every twisted version of her story. Headlines started appearing in local blogs: "Officer abuses single mother in HOA dispute," or "Neighborhood conflict turns into police overreach." Each article was another stab in our chest, painting my father as a villain in the story where he had only stood for truth. My mother tried to stay strong, but I saw her fingers tremble when she washed the dishes. I saw her delete social media apps after reading one too many hateful comments. People from our own community, people who used to wave when Dad drove by, now looked away or whispered behind his back. Even the department started to grow cold. The chief, a political man who cared more about optics than integrity, called my father in for a review meeting. He returned home late that evening, quiet and heavy, with eyes that told me everything before he even spoke. "They're putting me on temporary suspension," he said softly. The words were sharp enough to cut through the air. My mother tried to argue, but he just shook his head. "It's procedure," he added, though we all knew it wasn't procedure. It was politics. For the first time in my life, I saw my father take off his badge and place it on the table, not as a symbol of rest but of defeat. The metal gleamed faintly under the kitchen light, and I could almost hear the echo of every promise it once carried. That night, none of us ate. We just sat there, a family bound by silence, staring at a badge that had once made us proud but now felt like a burden. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done testing us. A week later, as I was helping my mother pick groceries, a man approached us in the parking lot. He looked nervous, glancing around as if afraid someone might see him. "You're Officer Raymond's son, right?" he asked. I nodded cautiously. He took a breath. I was there that night," he whispered. "I live across from Karen's place. I saw what happened. I saw her hit her own mailbox and blame your dad." My mother froze mid-motion, her hand gripping the grocery bag so tightly the paper began to tear. "Would you be willing to say that under oath?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The man hesitated but then nodded. "If it means clearing his name, yes." That single spark changed everything. Within a day, my father's lawyer filed a counterclaim for defamation and wrongful accusation. Evidence began to surface. Security footage from nearby homes, timestamps, and witness statements that painted a very different picture of the harassment Karen claimed. Turns out she had deleted the HOA surveillance footage from that night, but not before one of the members had backed up a copy. When the truth began to seep through the cracks, her arrogance started to crumble. Still, the courtroom wasn't kind. The first hearing was tense, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Karen sat on the left side of the room, dressed in somber colors, her expression that of a wounded saint. Her lawyer spoke with polished venom, using phrases like systemic abuse and emotional trauma. But when our lawyer took the floor and played the footage, Karen's car swerving, her shouting false accusations, the clear evidence that she struck her own mailbox, the room shifted. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. For the first time, she looked shaken. My father remained silent through most of it, hands folded, jaw firm, eyes forward. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there for dignity, for truth. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he stood up slowly, the kind of calm that carries both pain and power. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I've worn this badge for 20 years. I've seen what pride and lies can do to people. I don't need anyone's apology. I just need my name and my family's peace and return to me." The courtroom fell silent. Even Karen's lawyer seemed to lower his gaze. When the ruling came weeks later, it was decisive. Karen was found guilty of filing a false report and defaming a public officer. She was fined heavily, stripped of her HOA leadership and ordered to make a public apology. But the victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. The kind of victory you earn not because you sought glory, but because you refused to surrender your truth. After the trial, life moved differently. The neighbors who once whispered began greeting us again. The same chief who suspended my father called to personally reinstate him, pretending it was all standard protocol. But my father wasn't bitter. He returned to work with the same quiet dignity he'd always carried. He never bragged, never gloated. He just did his duty, because for him, justice wasn't about fame. It was about faith, yet the story didn't truly end there. Months later, as I walked past the park near our neighborhood, I saw Karen sitting alone on a bench. Her posture was smaller now, her energy subdued. For a moment, I almost walked away, but something inside me told me to stop. I approached her quietly, unsure why I even bothered. She looked up, eyes tired, and to my surprise, she whispered, "Your father's a good man." I was wrong. There was no bitterness, no sarcasm, just the raw voice of someone who had finally seen her reflection and didn't like what she found. I nodded, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. "He knows," I said softly, and walked away. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, I found my father on the porch, looking out over the street where it had all begun. The light caught his badge just right, making it glow like it once did before all the chaos. I told him what Karen said, and he just smiled faintly. "People can change," he murmured, "but only when the truth breaks them first." And in that moment I realized, justice isn't just about laws or courts. It's about endurance, about choosing integrity when the world offers you easier lies. My father never fought for revenge. He fought for the quiet rightness of his name, for the unseen dignity of doing the right thing when no one's clapping. That's what made him truly powerful. Not the badge, not the title, but the unbreakable spine of a man who refused to bow to deceit. And as I watched him stand there, calm against the dying light, I knew that night hadn't just broken us. It had remade us. Into something stronger, into something honest, into something that no whisper, no accusation could ever take away again. The weight of redemption life after the trial felt quieter, but not in the way silence feels peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that hums beneath the surface, a quiet made of reflection, of people learning how to live again after truth had torn through their illusions. Our neighborhood, once divided by whispers and pride, began to rebuild itself one hesitant conversation at a time. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid my father now waved again, their smiles awkward but sincere. It wasn't forgiveness they were seeking. It was relief, the relief that came when lies finally stopped poisoning the air. But my father, as always, didn't let bitterness stain his heart. He greeted everyone the same way he always had, calm, steady, with the quiet confidence of a man who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. For weeks after the verdict, I found myself replaying everything in my head. The shouting, the false accusations, the court, the shame, and finally the light of truth. It amazed me how fragile reputations were and how easily people chose sides without knowing the full story. My father had taught me what real strength looked like. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the kind that endures when no one believes in you. Watching him walk back into the police station, head high, badge polished and steady on his chest, made something shift inside me. I started to see the world differently. I realized that justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a man choosing to do the right thing even when the world turned its back on him. And yet, while things slowly returned to normal, something about my father had changed. His steps were still firm, his voice still calm, but there was a depth to him now, a quiet sorrow mixed with wisdom. Late at night, I'd find him sitting on the porch staring out into the darkness as if speaking to it. One night I joined him. The cicadas hummed softly, and a warm wind carried the faint smell of rain. For a long time we didn't speak. Then he said almost to himself, "People don't really see others anymore. They see what they want to believe." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. "When the truth finally comes," he continued, "it doesn't just set you free, it humbles you. It reminds you how easily any of us could have been on the wrong side of it." He turned to me then, his gaze steady and knowing. "That's why you can't live for their approval, son. Live by your own principles. They'll hate you for it sometimes, but when the storm passes, you'll still be standing." His words sank deep, leaving behind a warmth that felt both painful and empowering. It was the kind of advice that carves itself into your bones. Months later, the city held an award ceremony for community service. The police department wanted to quietly recognize my father for his integrity and composure during the ordeal, though it was clear they were also trying to repair their own image. My father accepted, but when it was his turn to speak, he didn't talk about himself. He talked about compassion, about the duty to seek truth before judgment. He said, "Every badge, every uniform, every title, they're temporary. What lasts is what you stand for when no one's watching." The room was silent for a long time after that. Even his former critics stood up and clapped. It wasn't applause for a cop. It was respect for a man who had walked through fire and refused to come out bitter. Meanwhile, life had taken a different turn for Karen. After the trial, she vanished from the HOA board, and for months her house sat dark and quiet. Some said she had moved away in shame. Others said she was dealing with personal troubles. But one morning I saw her car parked outside again, though it was old now and she moved slower than before. Her arrogance had burned away, replaced by something softer, regret perhaps. One afternoon I saw her tending to her garden, struggling to pull a stubborn weed. My instincts told me to walk away, but instead I crossed the street and offered to help. She looked at me with surprise, as if she couldn't believe I would even approach her. "I don't deserve your kindness," she said quietly, her voice raw. "You don't need to," I replied simply. "Everyone deserves a chance to start again." That small exchange changed something between us. Over the next few weeks we'd sometimes talk, not about the past, but about life. She told me she'd been attending counseling, trying to understand why she acted the way she did. She admitted that loneliness had made her cruel, that power had blinded her. She said she'd built walls so high she forgot there were people on the other side of them. I didn't excuse what she did, but I listened because I understood that redemption isn't about erasing what happened. It's about facing it without denial. My father never spoke badly of her again. When I told him she was trying to make amends, he nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their shadows." That was his way, to see beyond the surface, to look for humanity even in those who wronged him. It made me realize just how rare true strength was. Not the kind that fights to destroy, but the kind that forgives without forgetting. Time kept moving, as it always does. The seasons changed, and the neighborhood that had once been divided now hosted barbecues again. Kids played on the lawns, people greeted one another, and the old bitterness faded into memory. My father became somewhat of a quiet legend, not for his rank or his medals, but for his dignity. People came to him for advice, for mediation, for understanding. He never bragged about what happened. In fact, he avoided the topic altogether. But everyone knew that when the storm hit our street, it was his calm that held the ground together. As for me, I began studying law enforcement, not because I wanted to wear a badge, but because I wanted to carry the same integrity my father had shown. I wanted to be the kind of man who could look truth in the eye and not flinch. I still remember the day I told him about my decision. He looked at me, surprised at first, then proud. "Just remember," he said, "this job isn't about power. It's about trust. And trust is the hardest thing to rebuild once it's broken." I promised him I'd never forget that. A year after the incident, the community held a small event to honor those who had helped rebuild trust among neighbors. Karen came too, quietly, without seeking attention. When it was her turn to speak, she walked to the front and paused for a long moment before saying, "I once let pride turn me into someone I didn't recognize. But there's a man in this community who showed me that truth doesn't destroy. It heals if you let it." To Officer Raymond and his family, I'm sorry. The crowd was still. My mother's eyes welled up, and even my father, usually so composed, blinked hard before nodding respectfully. That moment wasn't about victory or humiliation. It was about release, the kind of peace that comes when people finally stop pretending and start healing. When the night ended and the lights dimmed, I stood beside my father as he looked out over the crowd one last time. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was proud, not just of himself, but of the fact that truth had won without bitterness. And as I looked at him, the man who had faced humiliation, lies, and judgment, yet still found grace and forgiveness, I understood that real heroes don't always wear capes or stand in the spotlight. Sometimes they're the quiet ones who stand their ground in the storm, not to destroy others, but to remind them of what honor looks like. That night, as we walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, I realized something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Justice isn't a moment. It's a legacy, and my father had built his not with power, but with patience, courage, and an unshakable heart. The son of a good man. The years passed quietly after that long night of truth and forgiveness, yet the echoes of what had happened never really left our home. They lingered in the way my father looked at people, in the way he treated every small act of honesty like something sacred, and in the way I began to measure my own choices against the example he had set. When I finally joined the police academy, I thought I was ready for anything. I'd studied the law, memorized procedures, learned self-defense, and practiced scenarios until my hands felt more like tools than flesh. But the first lesson I learned wasn't about tactics or authority. It was about restraint. The instructors could tell immediately that I carried something different. One of them, an older sergeant with tired eyes, once said to me, "You're too calm, Alvarez. Either that'll make you one of the best we've got, or it'll get you hurt." I didn't say it, but I knew where that calm came from. It wasn't confidence. It was discipline carved from years of watching my father survive injustice with grace. When I graduated, my father stood in the front row, quiet as always, his eyes shining but his mouth a straight line. After the ceremony, when the crowd thinned, he pulled me aside. "You've got my badge number engraved inside your hat," he said softly, tapping the rim. "Not because I want you to be me, but because I want you to remember what it cost." That sentence hit me harder than any lecture or training ever could. It was a reminder that every act of justice carries a price, and sometimes the receipt doesn't arrive until years later. My first posting was nothing like the dramas I'd imagined as a kid. It wasn't shootouts or high-speed chases. It was paperwork, neighbor disputes, late-night welfare checks, and endless conversations with people who just wanted someone to listen. And strangely, I found peace in it. The rhythm of the streets, the way people opened up when they realized you weren't there to judge. It reminded me of the very neighborhood that had once nearly broken my family. Sometimes, late at night, I'd park near the edge of a cul-de-sac, turn off my engine, and just listen to the quiet hum of sprinklers, the laughter of families behind thin walls, the simple sounds of peace. It reminded me why we fought so hard to preserve decency. Not for headlines or applause, but for this fragile normalcy that so many take for granted. It was during one of those long, quiet nights that I first met Jason, a teenager with a defiant stare and the kind of anger that didn't come from rebellion but from betrayal. His mother had called the station 3 times in a week, worried he'd fallen in with the wrong crowd. When I arrived at their house, he was sitting on the porch, headphones on, pretending not to notice me. I didn't try to scold him. Instead, I sat beside him and said, "You know, I used to think adults didn't understand anything either. But sometimes they're just scared of losing you before they can make things right." He didn't reply, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Over time, I learned that Jason's father had been accused of theft by his own co-workers. Falsely, it turned out. And ever since, Jason had stopped trusting anyone in uniform. That night, when I dropped him off after curfew, I saw a piece of myself in him. A kid watching someone he loved get crushed by injustice. I decided then that if I ever wanted to honor my father, I'd do it by helping others see that authority could still mean compassion. Months passed, and the world didn't stop turning. My father retired quietly, though the department begged him to stay a little longer. He smiled and said he'd done his time. But he didn't really retire, not in spirit. He spent his mornings volunteering at the community center, helping teenagers fill out college forms, fixing leaky faucets for old neighbors, and mentoring young officers who came to him for advice. One day I found him sitting at the center, showing a rookie how to defuse a confrontation without escalating it. He said, "Son, anyone can demand respect, but earning it, that's a skill." Around that same time, a new problem began brewing in the neighborhood where I was stationed. A small group of locals had formed a sort of vigilante watch, patrolling the streets and issuing warnings to anyone they deemed suspicious. At first, it sounded harmless, people just trying to keep their streets safe. But soon reports came in that they were harassing kids, shining flashlights into homes, even blocking certain families from walking through the park at night. When I arrived at the scene one evening after a complaint, I froze for a moment when I saw the group's leader. It was Karen, older, quieter, but unmistakably her. The years had changed her face. Less arrogance, more exhaustion. Yet there was still that same hunger for control simmering beneath the surface. She recognized me immediately. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "Officer Alvarez, I heard you followed in your father's footsteps." Her tone wasn't mocking. It was tired, almost regretful. I nodded and asked her what was going on. She insisted they were just trying to protect the neighborhood from vandalism and noise. But as I listened to the reports and spoke with the residents, it became clear that what she called protection was really intimidation. When I confronted her about it, she sighed heavily. "I was trying to make things right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "After everything that happened back then, I thought if I could keep this place safe, maybe people would see I'd changed." I could have written her up right then. She was clearly overstepping again, but something in her eyes stopped me. They weren't proud anymore, they were pleading. I told her, "Karen, you can't undo what happened by controlling everything again. Redemption isn't about proving you're right. It's about doing right when no one's watching." She nodded slowly, tears welling up as she whispered, "Your father told me something similar once. I should have listened." That night after I filed the report, I sat in my car and thought about how cycles repeat, how people fall back into their old patterns unless someone helps them find a different path. I realized that justice isn't just about catching wrongdoers. It's about breaking those cycles of pain, fear, and pride that make people lose their humanity in the first place. Weeks later, Karen quietly dissolved her so-called patrol group. Instead, she began volunteering at the same community center where my father worked. One afternoon, I found them together, my father showing her how to set up tables for an outreach event, both of them laughing softly over something simple. It was such an ordinary moment, yet it struck me like lightning. I understood then that redemption doesn't erase the past. It builds something gentler on top of it. My father hadn't just won a fight years ago. He had planted a seed, and now it was growing in ways none of us could have expected. But peace never lasts forever. One evening I was called to a domestic disturbance at the edge of town, a young woman screaming for help. When I arrived, the suspect was armed and cornered. He'd been drinking, furious, unpredictable. The backup was still minutes away. My training told me to keep my distance, to control the situation, but then I saw a child peeking from behind a couch, terrified, clutching a small toy. Everything else vanished from my mind. The suspect shouted threats, waving the gun wildly. I spoke to him softly, carefully, every word measured the way my father had always done. "No one's here to hurt you," I said. "Just let her go. Let the kid go." Minutes felt like hours, and every instinct screamed that one wrong move could end everything. But then something shifted. The man's voice broke. "I didn't mean to scare them," he said, lowering the weapon an inch. I took the chance, closing the distance, steady but slow. I disarmed him and cuffed him without force. When it was over, the woman sobbed in relief, clutching her child. I drove home that night shaking, realizing how thin the line between peace and chaos really was. How easily things could have gone wrong. When I told my father what happened, he just listened quietly, then said, "Now you understand. The hardest part of this job isn't courage, and it's mercy." He was right. It wasn't about winning or dominance. It was about compassion under pressure. It was about choosing understanding even when you had every reason to be angry. That night, as I sat alone in my car outside our old house, I looked at the fountain, the one my mother had loved, the one that had started it all. Its water still flowed gently, glowing under the soft light of the porch. I realized that every lesson, every trial, every scar had led to this, a legacy of decency passed from father to son, proof that doing good, even when no one claps, still matters. And as I closed my eyes and listened to the rhythm of that water, I whispered a silent promise to the man who had taught me everything. "I'll carry your calm into every storm, Dad. I'll make sure the badge means what it used to mean."